there are some wonderful documents that have survived. These are the factor's accounts for the factor. The king's factor was essentially his business manager, and they kept a very detailed record of money owed, money in, money out, that sort of thing. So one of the things they kept track of was customs and imports and exports. And so this shows that in 1512, San Cristobal was the name of the vessel. And he's importing, this first record doesn't have details, but just says vacas y otras cosas. And he's bringing them into San Germán. So Ponce is engaging in the cattle business in San Germán, which is actually a settlement controlled by his political enemies, but there's still good business there. So he's doing business there. And in Puerto Rico, he's importing cattle as well. He brings in 4 bulls and then 4 heifers, most likely. And he's already been here for a while, and he has a cattle herd. And so what you have to do if you're breeding and raising cattle is you have to bring in, other bloodlines, because otherwise, you have one bull and he's daddy to everybody, and that just isn't good after a while. So he's essentially improving his herds here. This part of the trade record occurs after the voyage to Florida, and we'll probably discuss that a little bit later. He also occasionally had things that were unloaded for him from some of these ships by some of the men who were his associates and worked for him. In this case, a horse was unloaded. And actually, there's this wonderful reference in these records to the vaquero of Juan Ponce de León, this guy named Alonso González Molano. A vaquero, of course, is the American translation is cowboy, but a vaquero was somebody who was a herdsman. He ran the cattle herds. This is probably the earliest reference to vaqueros in the New World that has come to my attention anyway. So Ponce also owned ships, and these he owned the Santiago and the Santa Maria de Consolación, and his ownership, as it survives in the records, suggests that he only owned ships because he was going to go on this trip to Florida. He was not. He'd unload things from other merchant vessels, but he was not engaged as a ship owner so much himself at this time, anyway. So this is the Santiago, which arrived from Spain in September of 1512 in anticipation of his trip to Florida. He already had the contract from the king to go explore to the north. And so here we have these 2 records, 14 and 15. These voyages represent the actual customs documents that were drawn up when the expedition was dispatched to Florida. Everybody knows that, a lot of people know that the expedition left from Puerto Rico, but actually it organized in Española, in Ponce's home port, where he had all his buddies from the war in Higüey and his properties. Discuss that. So the fleet, as I mentioned, 2 caravels. The Santiago was under Diego Bermudez, who brought it over from Spain, and Anton Alaminos was the pilot. Alaminos was an experienced Bahamas pilot, which meant that he was engaged in the slave trade, because that was the only reason people went up there. Ponce de León sailed on the Santiago. The Santa Maria de la Consolación was under the sailing master Pedro Bello, and Juan Bono de Quejo is given the title of captain, and in this case it represents his position in the overall expedition hierarchy. He's the second in command of the expedition. He's also shipmaster in his own right. And then we get to the Bergantin, San Cristobal. Now, the only written source that we have that discusses Ponce's trip to Florida is by a man named Herrera, who wrote in the late 16th century, consulting documents that were made on the voyage. And he describes the San Cristobal as a Bergantin. But there are also customs documents which discuss the return of this vessel from the expedition to Florida and describe it as a caravel. So there's a conflict between Herrera and the customs documents, and it's a real pain in the behind. because it means we don't know. Well, it looks like the San Cristobal was a ship that was sent out. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. So anyway, the fleet consisted of 3 caravels or 2 caravels and a bergantin. It's not certain we'll ever know for sure, because Herrera's the only source we have, and if we throw Herrera out, then where were you, right? Okay.
Can you tell the difference between the caravel and the bergantin?
Yes, indeed. This is a bergantin,
Okay.
right? Yeah, we're going there, yeah. It was essentially a galley. It was oared. You could take them in and beach them. And so this craft was the craft of preference for the Indian Wars, the Carib Wars that were occurring at that very time. They were also used for going up creeks and rivers for collecting water for the ships. And like I say, landing and recovering troops. So they could be sailed and or rowed. So when they were used in a military capacity, they would sail and approach an island, but at sea, drop the sail and then get on the oars, because that dropped their profile and they could just shoot in and really surprise the Caribs. Whereas you could see a tall, a caravel or a now coming from miles away because they had these big billowing sails. And this is a caravel, more or less. It was, later ships had galleys down below, but in those days they cooked on basically an iron sort of hibachi arrangement on deck, which meant that if it was really bad weather, you didn't have a hot meal. So these were the sort of ships that Columbus sailed as well. The caravels are pretty well known and famous for that. So, Ponce is considered the discoverer of Florida, but we know that Florida was actually discovered before 1513. Herrera, in his account of Ponce's voyage, opens up by saying, well, having had news that there's things to the north, Ponce then undertook this venture. And this is a 1511 map, 2 years before the trip to Florida. And it was published by a man named Peter Martyr, who was an Englishman who worked as a tutor for the king and queen's children in Spain. And so he had great access, and everybody comes back from the New World, he'd talk to him, interview him, take notes. And so he wrote this great big history. And he published this map. And it was immediately suppressed, because they're like, you cannot be giving out maps to the New World to all of Europe. That is not a good idea. So it was immediately suppressed. But some got out. And what it shows us Hispaniola here, which was essentially the center of the Spanish world at that time. Puerto Rico, it's still called San Juan. Cuba, Jamaica, Tierra Firme, right? Coast of South America, Central America. And then this large landmass to the north, labeled Isla de Bimendi Parte, part of the island of Bimini. Okay? Ponce's contract states that he's supposed to go out and discover the secrets of Bimini. So that's what he was doing. He had the contract. He had the rights to make that discovery. Everything was very licensed, still is, right? So this is a good idea of what the average Spanish mariner's geographic knowledge of the New World might have been at this time, unless, of course, they had been sailing along a particular coast and had intimate knowledge of that coast. So the fleet, as I mentioned, it started out in Española, in El Puerto de Yuma. And if you look at the ship traffic that came across the passage, along with Ponce's 2 ships, there were essentially a fleet of about 5 ships. They all came over within 2 or 3 days of each other. And a number of these other ships had people who were registered on other ships. Basically, they had people who were registered on this ship, that ship, or the other ship. But they were all going to go with Juan Ponce. And so some didn't get on this ship, they got on that ship. And so it was a bit confusing. And Ponce's ships were also carrying livestock. Now, when you carry livestock in a ship, you have to accommodate them. You have to have, slings and sort of stalls. So his ships were rigged for carrying livestock. So what happened was he couldn't stuff his ship with supplies in Salvaleon. So he came across, he unloaded his cattle and his livestock, and then he did the interior modifications, and I believe so supplies were taken from these other ships and put on board those ships, and then the crews all came together at that point in San Germán on the west coast of Puerto Rico. And so on March 4th, they depart. And they sail northwest by north. And, after a few days, they arrive in the Bahamas, which were then known as the Lucayos. Now, the Lucayos were also known as the inútiles, the useless islands. And they were useless because they had no gold. So what good could they be? But they did have Indians. And as I mentioned earlier, the Spaniards would go up and capture these Indians and bring them back as slaves to work in the mines and on the ranches. And by 1513, they'd been pretty depopulated. So the fleet travels through these islands and stops at a number of them where they record the latitude. And then they move on. And then they get to a place called Guanahani, which Guanahani is supposed to have been San Salvador, which was the island where Christopher Columbus first landed in the New World. That's still not clear which island in the Bahamas is the original Guanahani. A lot of scholars persuaded the Bahamian government that it was Watling Island, so they changed that to San Salvador. So now everybody says, oh, well, there's San Salvador, so that must be it. But it doesn't really work like that. But a lot of people like to start Ponce's voyage in the Bahama Islands at San Salvador. So, if you assume that the starting point is one place when in fact we don't really know where it is, it kind of can prove problematic for your theory later on. So they prepare a ship that needed some work there, and they prepared to cross the Golfo de Barlovento, the Windward Gulf. And essentially that's the big water. They knew that they were transitioning. We're leaving the islands now, we're going to go to something else. So they sail across the Golfo, and on March 27th, they sight an island. Now in the text, in Herrera's text, it's described as an island that nobody recognized. Okay. Well, Anton Alaminos, who'd been all over those islands, didn't recognize it. None of the other guys who'd sailed in those waters recognized it. So chances are pretty strong it's not one of the Bahamian islands. Okay. A lot of theories have it being Grand Bahama, Great Abaco, Man of War Key, Eleuthera. But in fact, it's the coast of Florida. And if you look at the text, the way it reads, traveled, arrived at a named destination in this latitude. Sometimes they don't give the latitude. And in this case, it's like arrived, saw an island, unidentified. Now, if you're looking for the island of Bimini, and you find an unidentified island, do you just pass it by, or do you stop and explore it? I would think that you would stop and explore it. But a lot of theories just say, oh no, that was this island, and they just passed it by. They weren't interested in it, which doesn't make a lot of sense. But if you look at what happened, so they find this island, and then they sail along in the same direction. They're coasting along the coast of Florida. And they sail for 3 days, coasting to the northwest. And then they hit foul weather. The weather gets bad. And the bad weather lasts till April the 2nd, at which point they approach land and take a latitude reading of 30 degrees 8 minutes. So all this time, from March 27th, they've been sailing the coast of Florida. And in that time, they also had stormy weather, and who knows what that does, right? But when that cleared, they approached land. You want plenty of sea room if you have bad weather, especially if it's like from the northeast. We have no idea where it came from, it doesn't say. But they approached the land and they got this noon shot, 30 degrees 8 minutes. That 30 degrees 8 minutes is located at the top of the GTM NER, or what's Guana State Park, to some of you folks. Now, we know that this latitude reading was taken from board the ship because immediately upon taking that latitude, they continued sailing north for the remainder of the day, and then they anchored in the evening. And then, this is a presumption, of course, but it's a pretty good one, they went ashore the next morning, as opposed to anchoring up at the evening and then going ashore at night when you can't see anything at all.